Have you listened to the last two episodes about comprehension-based language teaching and standards-based grading? Well, during those episodes, I referenced the book Honing Our Craft, World Language Teaching Today, as I prepared those topics. Well, in today's episode, I have the two editors of Honing Our Craft, Dr. Florencia Henshaw and Dr. Kim Potowski, who speak about their objective behind this project of collaborating to produce Honing Our Craft, what it was like working through the content with 15 different contributors, and how language teachers can most efficiently and effectively use this incredibly user-friendly resource. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and I always start by saying thank you for listening. So thank you so much for listening. But also thank you for being an incredible educator, because you're doing what? You're listening to a podcast about language teaching. So thank you so much for doing that. This is a very exciting episode today because over the last couple of weeks, I've been talking about the book Honing Our Craft, World Language Teaching Today. And on this episode, I have the two editors of this volume, who are Dr. Florencia Henshaw and Dr. Kim Potowski. Now, Dr. Florencia Henshaw is the Director of Advanced Spanish at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and Dr. Kim Potowski is a professor of Spanish linguistics. And for 18 years, she also directed the Spanish Heritage Language Program at the University of Illinois at Chicago. So, Kim and Florencia, thank you so much for being here today so that we can have an incredible conversation about this book, Honing Our Craft. I know that our listeners have heard the last couple of episodes, so we've done a deep dive into what this book is all about and what we can get from it.
We're ready to jump in. I just want to say thank you for having me again in your podcast.
Absolutely. You're officially now a member of the Two Timers Club for guests on the podcast, so thank you so much for coming back, and you're always welcome back for a third, so you can be in the Third Timers Club. We'll see how that goes moving forward. But let's continue with speaking with you to start off, Florencia. And when it comes to your objectives and your goals with Honing Our Craft, what is it that you hope teachers get out of reading this and implementing everything that they are seeing in this book?
Sure. I think that's a good question. What do we want the reader to get? I think to some extent it's very similar to what I hope people will get out of Common Ground. I'm just mentioning that because that was in your podcast. And that is, of course, information and inspiration, right? So we want people to continue their professional development and also feel inspired to try new things in the classroom. At the same time, Honing Our Craft is a little bit different than Common Ground because it covers very different topics, sometimes written from very different voices. And not everyone is going to agree 100% with everyone. And I think that's the beauty of our profession to some extent, right? We keep pushing each other, challenging each other, learning from each other. So what I hope they would get would be primarily new perspectives. I think it's great if you read something and it confirms everything you're doing or everything you believe, but it's also good to read something that pushes you and makes you rethink some things that you're doing or that you've held truth for a long time. That's how you grow. That's how you hone your craft. And then, yes, I would love to think that some readers are going to get very concrete ideas that they can adapt and try in their classrooms.
Yes, as I always say in the intro to this podcast, that this is for teachers that want confirmation that what they're doing is on the right track, and then also for those teachers that are looking to hone their craft even further. I don't actually say hone our craft, I'll say that for the purposes of this conversation, but it's really this idea that they want to go a little further. So not just confirm, but to go a little further with what they're doing. So that really puts the lens on what this book is all about. Let's take a look at the specifics within the book. And I went through each specific section of the chapters in some previous episodes, but I'd like you to give us some insights about the layout. And for a quick reminder for listeners, the way each chapter is laid out, there are different writers and contributors. So there are different chapters, but we start each chapter with an abstract, and then there's a contextualization section, and then there's a section on key terms, then possible misconceptions, and then demonstrations and suggestions at the end. And it's such a user-friendly format. And just every chapter I felt was doable because of the way that it was presented. So, Kim, can you talk to us about the process of coming up with a layout for the chapters and what that was like working with the different writers that contributed?
Just to first pick up on your emphasis of the word honing, I just looked up the definition of honing, and it's sharpen or refine. So I remember when we were kicking around ideas for the title, we wanted to think of teaching as a craft. And as a craft, it's something you're always practicing. It's always something you get better at, Mm-hmm. We say that we practice law, we practice medicine, right? It doesn't mean like we're not good at it yet. We're still learning, but we are always still learning. So I think that's where the honing idea came from. A number of years ago, I edited a book about different languages in the United States. And I came up with this idea of it sort of being like a cookie cutter. I know I'm not the first person to do that, but it occurred to me that would be a good format for that book. In other words, the sections, I asked each author, hey, do you want to write about German in the US? Do you want to write about French in the US? And that just made sense. We did have some changes, right, Florencia? We had some words that we were using for the subsections, but then we realized it wasn't quite, people weren't putting there what we had envisioned, and we realized we needed to maybe change those words just a little bit. So we ended up going through a bit of a change there, but thank you for pointing out the user-friendliness of it. That was something we were going for. I think it still happens, unfortunately. You've got your research, then you've got your classroom. How do you bridge those two things, right? We don't want to ask, they're certainly intelligent and capable enough to read original research, right? But who has the time to wade through it, right? These are experts, 15 experts who've either done the research themselves or read through it and have distilled it and presented it in a way that a very busy teacher can grab onto it.
Yeah, one of my big takeaways of every chapter is at the very end where there's the two columns of do this and don't do that, right? And so talk to us about how you were able to work with all of the contributors and then even within your own chapters to really boil it down to 3 or 4 bullet points of do this and don't do that. What's that process like, and how do you make that so user-friendly for teachers?
What I would probably say is that what I know I was guilty of this is, in the first drafts, is the do's and don'ts then become things that are do's and don'ts that apply to anything. And I think the key for a good, memorable do and don't is when it's very, very specific to the topic and very specific with the types of challenges and struggles that we see in the classroom. Mm-hmm. And so for a topic, I'm just going to go with my chapter. So for telecollaboration, maybe a do would be something like you need to start with a small pilot of it, right? So don't start thinking that you can do it all and do it in a big project, right? And that's how you get overwhelmed, right? So I think that when we made the do's and don'ts and we asked the authors, we gave feedback to the authors on how can we make this more specific to your topic and more specific to challenges that are associated with implementing this particular concept or technique or approach to the classroom. And I think that's why a lot of people are saying that the do's and don'ts resonate with people, or that they find them useful.
Yeah, next to my desk in my classroom, when I'm doing my planning, I have up on the wall this thing that says what something is and what it's not. And so I have one that is about interpersonal speaking. So it says on one side, this is what interpersonal speaking is, and this is what it is not. Because sometimes when I'm planning in my mind, this is an interpersonal activity that I'm doing, and then I just look up and I see, oh no, it's not, and how do I change that? So I just really liked that very concrete way of do this and don't do that. So this whole process of being the editor of a volume, now I understand you both also contributed chapters to the volume, but let's put that aside for a second and let's take a look at what this process is like to be the editor of the volume. I'm very intrigued by it because the last time you were on the podcast, Florencia, we were talking about a book that you actually wrote start to finish with a co-author, but you wrote it. And so that feels like it's a very different process to me than editing a volume with other contributors for each chapter. So Kim, can you talk to us about what that role is of an editor and this whole process of editing a volume like Honing Our Craft?
I can tell you it's different from any other editing project I think I've done, and I've probably done about 5 of them, but this one was, not only did it have that sort of recipe to follow, right, the cookie cutter structure that we thought would give uniformity to all the chapters, but we also needed it to be, super digestible by the teachers or the folks reading it. So, we came up with the different sections, and there was a blurb of what we wanted each section to look like. And I believe we uploaded that to a Google Doc, and everybody had access to look at that. And then that's what people did. They generated it, and nothing's ever perfect at the first draft. So they would turn things in, and then we would ask questions, and there was back and forth like there typically is.
It depended a lot on the topic, so the feedback was very tailored to whatever the authors were sending us back. I think a lot of the comments we made were, us anticipating what would a teacher think, reading this. And based on what I see, teachers ask each other on social media, just to make sure that we were keeping our reader in mind as much as possible. And so it wasn't that the first draft was bad. It's just that all of a sudden we would think, okay, if I were reading this and knowing what I've seen in Facebook posts, this is probably something that a reader might be wondering. Yeah, that sounds great, but what do I do with X, right? So those kinds of things, that's the feedback we gave to a lot of authors, just because we wanted the book to address those questions, those what ifs that the readers were likely to have in mind. Yeah.
Florencia, you had said at the beginning that the goal of Honing Our Craft was information and then to provide inspiration as well. So just to dive a little deeper into what we were just saying about the topics. So you had this idea of what you wanted this book to accomplish. And so did you lay out the 12 topics and then reach out to specific writers to write about those topics? I'm very curious about how that all plays out.
Yes, that's exactly what it was like.
Okay,
we brainstorm topics in a Google Doc or something along those lines. We started brainstorming possible authors, and at some point, I think we just simply started narrowing it down. Sometimes based on availability. There were other chapters we wanted to include, but for various reasons, we were not able to. So maybe there might be a volume 2. We'll see.
I love how you mentioned the idea of the questions that we see asked there out in the world, out on Facebook or in conferences or whatever. And as you notice, in the book, there's lots of direct. How can we collaborate ethically? How do we? What if I? It's just. And that just, when you pick it up and you open to any page, I got to give Cled a lot of, props here, because the layout is visually attractive. There's, boxes with quotes, there's questions. It's just, it does read sort of like a conversation.
And how did your initial collaboration, the two of you, come together to be working together as the editors on this volume?
Well, Cled, correct me if I'm wrong, Florencia. I mean, they reached out to me and asked me if I wanted to do it. And I was like, only if Florencia does it with me.
and I still have the email where Kim sent me the email, and I think my response was, is it Christmas morning? I was so honored and excited that she thought of me that I was like, yes, this is not even a question. Of course, yes.
Florencia is one of the clearest voices in the language teaching field, in my opinion. And when I read Common Ground, I was just like, wow, yeah, this is, I dig this. I dig this a lot. I dig what she's doing and how she's doing it. And her presence on social media as well, just with the clarity, the helpfulness. So I was just like, yeah, I'm interested. I think this is a great idea, but I ain't doing it by myself. And I ain't doing it without Florencia. So thank God she said yes.
And can I ask you specifically what the two of you learned from the contributors of these different topics? I mean, we can't be experts on every topic, right? You would have written this whole book on your own if you had all the insights on all these topics. So what are some things that you actually learned from the writers that contributed to the different chapters?
So everything they wrote about their topics. There's, things I didn't know. I mean, I guess I knew enough to know that these topics are important, right? So maybe in some ways, not only is this a labor of love for the profession, but it's also kind of selfish. Like, I want to know all this stuff. Thanks, guys, for writing this book for me so that I can read it and learn stuff. Yeah, I learned stuff from every single chapter.
I'd say, I mean, again, same. I would not have been able to write those chapters. So my knowledge is completely limited on all those chapters to be able to write a chapter like that. Of course, there's things that you already have some knowledge of, like differentiated instruction. I knew a little bit about. It wasn't that it was completely all new information, but you still learn things that you didn't know, right? So small questions that I still had about differentiated instruction that Deborah addressed. Standards-based grading, right? It's like, I sort of get it, but I'm not sure, right? So all of these topics that translanguaging, I learned a lot in that chapter, and a lot of that I'm still thinking about, but that is a good thing, right? So I think for all of them, yeah, you learn a lot. Even if you think you know, you still learn. Okay, I'll give you the perfect example. Claudia Fernandez's chapter on comprehension-based teaching. And you might think, well, but, you wrote Common Ground, you know about Van Patten, you know about this, I mean, everybody that she cited, I'd read all those works. And even then, I learned so much editing Claudia's chapter to be able to give her feedback and ask her questions that even sometimes, we had to have conversations about these questions. But I'm like, this is important to include, right? Because you can't just move past it. You can't just let's just say comprehensible, but not define it. No. But because a lot of people are thinking, what does it really mean? So it's like, even all of those things that you think you knew them, it gives you that chance to look at them a second time, third time, fourth time, pause, and really be learning more, expanding your knowledge on it. So I think for each and every chapter, yeah.
And that's the interesting thing about this being the Q&A type thing. If anyone were to look at the draft documents, because we did this all, I don't know what we did before Google Drive, but we had everything on Google Drive, which is where they would upload their drafts. And then Florencia, you know how you can insert comments in the margins, right? Those are actual, all of them, full-blown conversations, right? So if Florencia or I had a question, what do you mean by this? Or what does this mean? Or does this contradict that? Or can you give me an example of this? You could probably bet a nickel that at least one other reader is going to have that same question. So that's a very interesting process. But yeah, those dialogues in a couple of cases prompted, we were like, hey, we better jump on a Zoom and just talk this out, And so that helped land some of these points a little more clearly. So we were in a very privileged position to be able to directly ask the authors, what do you mean by this? Because we truly needed to ask that question in order to understand the content. And I like to think that then helps the clarity of the content, right, of the chapter. Because, I think a lot of times we get very used to writing for people who we sort of know are going to understand us. And it's a privilege to have somebody say, well, wait, can you clarify that? Somewhat like what you're doing here. I feel like I know how editing a book works, and you're asking these really good questions about it, and that makes me reflect on it.
Yeah, I can echo a lot of that when it comes to doing a podcast, where I get to have my solo episodes where I go into my own wheelhouse on things, but then I can have published authors like yourself on to talk about their books, and other teachers that are doing other things in the classroom that I'm yet to try out. And that's a total realm where I am learning as well. So I really appreciate that opportunity. And it also gives me this opportunity to ask all the personal questions with the hope that at least one listener out there actually has that same question and they're thinking about it as well. So, Florencia, how would you suggest that once a teacher orders this book this book that, as Kim pointed out, is a very attractive book. It really is, the great layout and everything about it. But how would you suggest that teachers, readers that are using this book are using it most effectively? Is honing our craft something that we want to read cover to cover, use it as a manual? What are your suggestions for what do we do when this book comes in the mail?
It's a good question. I think the beauty of it is that you don't need to read it cover to cover, and you don't even need to read it in any particular order. I think that some chapters will have cross-references, but those can be mental notes to go and check them out later. It doesn't mean that you won't understand what the author is saying just because you didn't read that other chapter. I think some chapters complement each other, perhaps better than others. And so it would be good to read them together. But I envision them as, more of a start flipping through it, look at the table of content, start by the one that is sort of calling your attention more. Maybe it could be a topic that you've always wanted to know more about, and that's where you're starting. Or perhaps it's a topic that you're really passionate about. I can see a lot of the, comprehension-based special interest group in ACTFL going straight for the chapter on comprehension-based, and nothing wrong with that, because again, some of it might be confirmation, some of it might be expansion of knowledge or things they had not considered. But I think it has a little bit of everything. I wouldn't read it cover to cover, although you certainly could. I would personally jump around and go to different topics as they sort of call my attention. I can see it being really, really helpful for reading groups and professional development groups because it allows you to explore various topics from a variety of voices. And I think that makes the conversations richer. Mm-hmm. I can also see it being useful for so-called methods courses, especially when it comes to certain topics that the students may need to understand a little bit better. For example, my colleague Jude Krushnowski directs the Language Teacher Education program, and he wants to assign a reading for the students on differentiated instruction. But if you look out there, he would have to assign an entire book, and the students are not going to read or buy an entire book. Mm-hmm. But they might be very likely or more likely to read a chapter where the information is distilled, condensed with examples, and here you have, in a nutshell, what you need to know about differentiated instruction. So I see it being useful for that.
I think that the chapters are also very digestible in terms of, yes, the layout, which is really useful, but I also think that they're maybe 15 to 20 minutes each to read. So it's really not going to go much longer than that. So this is something that, teachers could read a chapter before going to bed and be thinking about it for the next day and figure out what that's going to be and how it's going to be useful for them.
And that's a challenge to anybody can write a really long chapter. It's mm-hmm. It's paring it down. And that's, I guess, lots of famous writers have said similar things, right? Quotes mm-hmm. about how, writing it is easy. It's taking stuff out that's hard. And there was a couple cases, including mine, where it was like, wow, you are so over the page limit. You got to cut out a whole bunch of stuff. And mm-hmm. and that's how I think that contributed to the really powerful, potent, sort of nature of these chapters, is that they had to just get to the basics, get quickly in a very easy, digestible fashion.
I'm an impatient reader. Mm-hmm. So that's why I like very concise writing. Just like, do we need this? Probably not. Do we need this? No, right. But it's just because I am a very impatient reader. I still remember grad school reading those long articles that is like, why are you telling me this? Right. So that's why I'm a big fan of concise writing.
Yeah, I find that sometimes I just go to the page with the do this and don't do that to figure something out after I've already read the chapter. And it's really helpful and it's quick and easy to digest and remind myself of. So those are just incredibly helpful to use it as that kind of manual. So I wanted to let our listeners know that in the show notes, there is a link to get your own copy of Honing Our Craft from CLET World Languages right from their website. And along with it, you will get a discount code for 25% off. So Clet World Languages is offering that, and the code is right there in the show notes. It is Joshua25 HOC, so JOSHUA 25 HOC, all caps. It's in the show notes, so don't worry if you didn't get it right there. So make sure that you get the link and you dive into the book right away. So before we say our goodbyes, I always like to leave our listeners with some hearty advice. So when it comes to picking up a book like Honing Our Craft, a book on language teaching, and that's a huge topic, right? So, okay, I'm intrigued now. This book, 12 chapters, 12 different people, really digestible. Apparently it's really pretty, all this stuff. So I'm going to order it, right? So what is some advice that you would leave with our listeners about honing our craft?
I would probably say to be open, to read with we call it respectful curiosity. So even if something's challenge what you do in the classroom, don't take it personally, just think about it. But don't be overwhelmed. Don't try to do it all. Don't read it all and feel like everybody's critiquing everything you're doing. So just focus on the one thing you are opening yourself up to learning, that you're curious to learn more about. Start there, and little by little, it's an art form to be open to changing and to be open to rethinking things. And so, start with one thing. Don't get overwhelmed, and you'll see how fun it is actually to grow and to change how you used to be. I know Kim gives examples too, I do too, right? The things we used to do when we taught that we had to rethink. And at first it's not easy. But as you learn, you grow and you feel better. You feel more confident about your teaching.
And on that note, I would say keep the book around somewhere, because you might pick it up and read it all the way through. You might read a couple things here and there, and as Florencia just said, you might decide, okay, yeah, no, that resonates with me. I dig it. I want to grow in that direction. I'm going to try that thing. And then you find yourself 6 months later, if it's nearby, you might grab it again. So just have it nearby. I don't think it's a, hit it and quit it kind of book. I think you want to have it around to continue to look at. And it is about being a growth mindset, right? We all know a teacher who says, I've been teaching 20 years. And really, they've been teaching 1 year, and they repeated it 19 times, right? We don't necessarily want to be that teacher. And this is a way to help do that, is to keep a book like this, around, and then just sort of keep jumping back to it when you feel it. But if you have it sort of out and then it catches your eye, you can be like, oh yeah, that book, and then jump in again and pick up another nugget.
I also appreciate the different voices that come through from each chapter and the different writers, because now I sort of know who to look to in these different areas. They're not necessarily names I knew about before, but now I associate them with these topics. I can look into them further. So it was really a way of honoring their work. You're reaching out to them and giving them a platform to show what they are doing and to introduce all of us to them as well. So thank you for doing that and for all of the incredible work that went into this volume. I really appreciate all the additional insights that you've given me and our listeners today on the episode. And just a quick reminder to listeners to get your own copy. The link is in the show notes to the Clet World Languages website to get your copy of Honing Our Craft. And there is a discount code Joshua25 HOC to get 25% off. And then we can continue the conversation from there. But Florencia and Kim, thank you so much again. This was an absolute pleasure. I've been looking forward to it for a while, and I'm so happy that the day is finally here. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you,
Joshua.
Us.
What are your takeaways from that conversation with Dr. Florencia Henshaw and Dr. Kim Potowski? I am even more inspired than ever to dive into honing our craft even further, and I for sure will be reaching out to some of the contributors to join me here on the podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes to get your copy of Honing Our Craft with a discount code that will get you 25% off. You'll also see the link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. And of course, there are also links to get in touch with me if you'd like to work together, either in person in your school or remotely. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, WLClassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.